On September 30th, 1959, a Canadian court sentenced a 14-year-old boy to hang, the youngest person Canada had ever placed on death row. The single piece of evidence that convicted him has since been called junk science, and the person who would spend the next 5 decades fighting to prove his innocence hadn't even met him yet. This is that story. His name was Steven Truscott. The girl he was convicted of killing was Lynne Harper, 12 years old, his classmate. The trial lasted 15 days. The jury took a few hours, and the evidence that sent a child toward the gallows was one doctor's guess about a stomach's contents, delivered to the court as if it were fact. Clinton, Ontario, summer of 1959. A small town built around a Royal Canadian Air Force base, the kind of place where every parent knew every kid on a bicycle, and every screen door slammed the same way on a hot afternoon. Steven Truscott was 14, an Air Force officer's son, athletic, well-liked, the boy teachers never worried about. Lynne Harper was 12, newer to town, still finding her footing among the base kids, the kind of girl who was starting to make friends fast because she was easy to like. On the evening of June 9th, several neighbors saw an ordinary scene. Steven giving Lynne a ride on his bicycle's handlebars, heading down the county road toward the river. He said he dropped her at a highway intersection where she planned to hitch a ride home. He said he watched her climb into a gray Chevrolet, then turn back toward town. She never came home. Her father reported her missing just before midnight. What followed was the kind of night a small town doesn't forget. Porch lights left on, neighbors walking the ditches with flashlights, mothers calling their own kids inside early and not quite saying why. 2 days later, in a wooded lot called Lawson's Bush, searchers found her body. She had been raped and strangled. A town that had never locked its doors was suddenly hunting a killer, and the last person known to have seen Lynne Harper alive was a 14-year-old boy who, 24 hours earlier, had just been another kid on a bicycle. Police needed an answer, fast, and Steven was standing right there. 2 days after Lynne's body was found, he was arrested. The Crown pushed to try him as an adult, not juvenile court, but a courtroom carrying the full weight of the criminal code, including its most severe penalty. The case rested almost entirely on one man's opinion. Pathologist Dr. John Penistan examined the contents of Lynne's stomach and told the court she died between 7 and 7:45 that evening, the exact window Steven had been with her. It was delivered as science. Modern pathologists would later call that kind of time of death estimate unreliable at best. The jury of 1959 had no way of knowing that. They also never learned that evidence pointing toward other possibilities, including a mysterious car, had been kept from Steven's own defense. The trial ran 15 days. Over 60 witnesses, many of them children, took the stand. The jury deliberated for a few hours, added a recommendation for mercy that carried no legal weight, and came back guilty. Under the law of the day, for a 14-year-old convicted of capital murder, Justice Ronald Ferguson had exactly one sentence left to give.
You shall be hanged by the neck until you are dead.
At 14, Steven Truscott became the youngest person ever sentenced to death in Canadian history. For months, he waited in a cell for an execution date that kept moving. A boy, alone, listening to construction sounds outside the prison wall and wondering if they were for him.
I thought they were building a scaffold. It's just living in terror. Every day you expect it to be your last.
In January 1960, the federal cabinet commuted his sentence to life in prison. He was sent to Collins Bay Penitentiary, a maximum security prison full of hardened adult men. What happened next wasn't what anyone expected. Inmates serving time for far worse crimes heard his story, looked at the teenager in their midst, and decided he didn't belong there. Men with every reason to turn away instead became his protectors, in a place built to break exactly the kind of person he was. Protection wasn't freedom. He served 10 years before parole came in 1969. He walked out at 24, understanding he was still, in the eyes of the law and his country, a convicted child killer. So he disappeared. He took a new name, Stephen Bowers, moved to Guelph, and became a quiet millwright, trying to outrun a story the whole country still knew by heart. What he didn't know: 3 years earlier, in a bedroom not far from where he'd eventually settle, a 16-year-old named Marlene had picked up a book, The Trial of Steven Truscott, and couldn't put it down. She wasn't from Clinton. She had no connection to the case at all. She was too young to remember the original trial, too far removed to have any reason to care. But something about a boy sentenced to hang at 14 lodged itself in her and wouldn't leave. She read it once, then read it again, staying up long after her parents had gone to bed, working through the timeline like it was a puzzle someone had left unfinished on purpose. Other girls her age were reading about boys they liked. Marlene was reading trial transcripts. That same book, published in 1966, sparked a national uproar loud enough to force a Supreme Court review of the conviction. And in a devastating blow, the court upheld the original verdict. Stephen, still in prison, absorbed the news that even Canada's highest court had looked at his case and said the answer was still yes. Imagine being that boy, locked in a cell for a crime you didn't commit, watching the entire country argue about your guilt, and then watching the last legal door close anyway. Marlene didn't stop reading. Where most people who'd been gripped by the book moved on within a year, she didn't. She kept following every scrap of coverage she could find for the rest of the decade. A teenager, then a young woman, carrying a stranger's case around with her the way other people carry a grudge or a grief. She had no way of knowing that the boy in that book was, at that exact time, building a life a few towns away under a different name. Think about what that actually asks of a 16-year-old. To read about a stranger's worst day, feel something close to recognition, and then just keep carrying it, year after year, with no one asking you to, and no reward waiting at the end of it. Most people who read that book closed it and moved on with their lives. Marlene didn't get to explain why she couldn't. When they finally met after his release, it wasn't through the case at all. Just two young people crossing paths in the same small city. But something in both of them recognized the other almost immediately. She knew, within a conversation or two, exactly who he had been convicted of being. She knew what saying yes to him would mean. A life spent explaining nothing, defending someone the whole country still called a killer, raising children under a name that wasn't real. She married him anyway, certain, before there was a shred of new evidence, that the conviction was wrong. It wasn't blind faith. It was 10 years of reading. Together they built a hidden life. 3 children, raised for years without the full truth of their father's past. A marriage lived under a name that wasn't really theirs. A secret carried quietly at school drop-offs and church potlucks, and every ordinary afternoon in between. Marlene never let the case go quiet in her own mind, even while she was living inside the ordinary noise of raising a family. When CBC investigative reporter Julian Scher began digging into the conviction in 2000, Stephen, for the first time in 30 years, agreed to speak publicly under his real name on the Fifth Estate. In 1997, the lawyers of Innocence Canada had formally taken the case, and it was Marlene, more than anyone, who became its engine. Picture what that actually looked like. Evenings after the kids were asleep, a kitchen table covered in photocopied court transcripts instead of dishes, a woman with no legal training cross-referencing a pathologist's 40-year-old testimony against itself, line by line, looking for the seam where it didn't hold. More than 20,000 pages by the time it was over, Witness statements, appeal records, old newspaper clippings, letters from people who remembered a detail no one had ever followed up on. She drove to archives on her own time. She tracked down retired officials who had long since stopped expecting anyone to call. At first, some of the lawyers around the case treated her the way people often treat the wife of a convicted man. Politely, but as a bystander. That didn't last. Within a couple of years, Julian Scher was building parts of his own reporting directly off what she'd found, and Innocence Canada's lawyers were routing questions through her first, because she simply knew the file better than anyone else alive. That research turned out to be the thread that finally unraveled a 50-year-old verdict, and the thread itself was made of insects. Forensic entomologists studied evidence collected from Lynne's body back in 1959, but never properly used at trial, the life cycle of the flies that had colonized her remains. Their conclusion rewrote the entire timeline. She likely died later than the original theory claimed, on the morning of June 10th, a time when Steven was sitting in a classroom in full view of his teacher and classmates. A 2004 review by retired Judge Fred Kaufman acknowledged serious problems, but stopped short of clearing him. One more frustration in a fight that refused to end. One more year Marlene kept going anyway. On August 28, 2007, the Ontario Court of Appeal quashed the conviction. 48 years after a jury sentenced a child to hang, Steven Truscott was acquitted. At the press conference, at 62 years old, he said it simply. "I never in my wildest dreams expected that in my lifetime this would come true." The province apologized. In 2008, Ontario awarded him $6.5 million, money that could never return a childhood or the 50 years of living under a stolen name. His case is now credited as one of the reasons Canada abolished the death penalty in 1976, and it directly shaped a legal rule, the Stinchcombe disclosure requirement, that now forces prosecutors to hand the defense everything they have. Innocence Canada, the organization that formally reopened Steven's case back in 1997, is still fighting today. The same fight, different names, different files, same system, still capable of getting it wrong. None of it happens without the woman who read a book at 16 and never stopped. In 2021, more than 50 years after she first opened that book, the University of Guelph awarded Marlene Truscott an honorary degree for a lifetime of advocacy most of the world never saw happen. No headlines for the nights at the kitchen table, no byline on the 20,000 pages. In her own words, "I am so honored to be recognized for my contributions towards Steve's long and difficult road in righting a wrong that was made by the justice system in Canada. I am hopeful that the legacy of my work on his case will serve as an inspiration to others to continue to improve our justice system and to never give up hope." Lynne Harper's murder has never been solved. That part of this story has no ending. But Steven Truscott's story does, because one teenage girl refused to close a book, refused to let a wrongful verdict outlive the truth, and spent her whole life proving that love, sometimes, looks like 20,000 pages of court transcripts, read one at a time, until someone finally listened. If this story hit you the way it hit us, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We tell one story like this every week, and you won't want to miss the next one.